大家午安。
I just want to start by thanking Taiwan Watch and the chairman of the board, Mr. Wu, for organizing this launch. We're especially grateful for their long-time commitment to translating the World Watch Institute's publications.
那首先让我感谢看守台湾协会以及主协办的各个单位以及我们的赞助者来帮忙组织这个活动。那我们特别要感谢呢看守台湾协会，他们长久以来在过去10年当中一直在翻译看守世界研究中心的刊物。
I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the Taiwan Forestry Bureau for hosting this event. And I'd like to thank the other speakers on our panel, Mr. Gu and Mr. Pern, and our moderator, Mr. Zhou.
那同时我要这边感谢林务局为我们安排这个场地，然后以及另外2位讲者洪教授以及郭教授，还有我们的主持人周教授。
And please let me also thank our very gracious Taiwan staff and volunteers who have been translating our talks and been very patient with me this week.
那还有在过去几天当中照顾我们的一些志工，还有协助翻译的伙伴，我们也特别感谢他们。
Before I begin my presentation and present State of the World 2011 Innovations that Nourish the Planet, I'd like to show a short video that describes some of the work that Nourishing the Planet has done over the last 2 years.
那在正式进入我们的分享之前呢，我想要给大家看一个短短的5分钟的影片，让大家看一下我们在非洲这个滋养地球的计划的一些工作状况。
Over the last 2 years, as part of World Watch Institute's Nourishing the Planet project, we've traveled to 25 nations throughout Eastern, Southern, and Western Africa, talking to farmers groups, policymakers, researchers, and scientists, hearing directly about stories of hope and success in agriculture from people working on the ground. These stories of innovation point the way toward a more hopeful future for agriculture in Africa and beyond. So here in farmers' own words are 3 major shifts we invite the global community to consider. Go beyond seeds. While seeds play a vital role in producing the food needed to feed the hungry, they are only one piece in the large and complex global food system. Building soils, investing more research on indigenous crops, and investing in other elements of the farm landscape hold vast opportunities for raising incomes and reducing poverty.
In West Africa, we say that cereals are the main foods. But no one in West Africa eats cereal without vegetables. So increasing the production of vegetables, consumption, and also productivity is important.
Go beyond farms. For many communities, the solutions don't lie in producing more food, and they may not even lie on the farm. Instead, it's important to make better use of the food already produced, roughly 40% of which is wasted worldwide. School settings offer some of the best opportunities for removing the cultural, economic, and social impediments to food security. So does tying millions of small farmers into local and regional food networks across Africa.
With these little children, to teach them how to produce food, how to prepare that food, and how to eat that food, because we believe so much in eating local food and producing local food.
The farmer is a private person. He's not a beneficiary of donor money. He's a private individual. He makes money, and we must make sure that he makes that money. He has a lot of risk to take, limited resources. So we have to cushion that farmer, not by providing free money and subsidized inputs and all the rest of it, but by making sure that the opportunities the farmer has for outputs, for inputs, for reduction in risk, all these things take place so that farmer can be persuaded to make a real decision to invest those resources in productivity enhancement.
What we have found for the last 6 years that I've been working with them is we came in to address the food needs
at home, but we have ended up commercializing the farmers. And they are now very happy because they are able to produce enough food for their houses and some to sell. The money they get from selling is able to meet some needs, especially paying school fees, meeting medical bills, and also supporting their neighbors and their relatives, even in the rural areas.
Go beyond Africa. Now is the time to position farmers in Africa on the front lines of issues like climate change and water scarcity. International solidarity in the realm of food, embodied by everything from fair trade cashews to farmers groups like Via Campesina to cross-continental collaborations like the Global Seed Trust, is among the most hopeful of innovations. Africa can be a leader in international carbon markets, fair trade arrangements, and sharing of food diversity and food cultures across borders.
A lot of the investments that we're seeing is that researchers, policymakers want to be the ones that pass on information, that pass on knowledge to farmers or to the very people that want to develop and be in charge of their own destiny. But what we have not done is to invest in allowing these people to share information with us and for us to be able to hear their voices and translate them.
Collectively, these shifts represent a radical new direction for the global food system. But given the limited ability of scientists to find solutions, the neat generosity of donors to support agricultural research, and the limited patience of struggling farmers and poor and hungry families, a shifting of funds in new directions is overdue. As we look at the innovative farmers on the ground in Africa, from the slums of Nairobi to the coastlines of Ghana, to the markets of Zambia and the fields of Tanzania, we see that the agricultural community is ready. It's time for the rest of us to catch up.
我想先请问一下，大家会不会觉得讲者的麦克风太小声？有一点是不是？
So I hope everyone can hear me now. Again, my name is Danielle Nierenberg, and I am director of the World Watch Institute's Nourishing the Planet project.
那再一次的向大家自我介绍，我的名字是 Danielle Nierenberg。那我是看守世界研究中心这次滋养地球的创新方法的计划的主持人。
For the past year and a half, I've traveled to 25 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, talking to farmers groups, researchers and scientists, policymakers and academics, journalists and aid agencies, getting their thoughts on what's working to help alleviate hunger and poverty while also protecting the environment.
那在过去的1年半当中呢，我在非洲的漠南非洲地区旅行了25个国家，那拜访了当地的农民的组织、研究员或者是科学家，还有一些记者，还有相关的学术单位甚至是立法者，还有政府机构，去了解说他们认为在面对饥荒以及对抗贫穷这件事情，哪些是成功的案例。
My colleague Bernard Pollock is also here today. He's the Director of Communications for the World Watch Institute, and he's also available to answer questions about our very extensive outreach and communications programs.
那我的同事 Bernard Pollock 先生呢，他也在场，他是我们看守世界研究中心的传播主任。那他今天也在场，可以回答各位有关于他们怎么样对外做联系以及做推广计划的一些问题。
In January, we released State of the World 2011 Innovations that Nourish the Planet.
那在2011年的1月，我们出版了这本2011世界现况。
This book brings together 60 of the world's leading experts on food and hunger and on issues ranging from participatory research and biodiversity to moving eco-agriculture into the mainstream.
那这本书邀集了超过60位以上的专家来为我们作为作者。那这些作者的领域包括了参与式的研究，那以及如何减少食物的浪费，以及参与式以及生态农业。那希望把生态农业转化为主流。
About a year from now, policymakers, activists, NGOs, and other stakeholders will gather in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil for the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development.
在未来不到1年的时间当中呢，有一群倡议者、科学家，还有一些记者以及关心环境的人士，将再次在里约热内卢的世界高峰会再次的相聚。
20 years ago, the first Rio Earth Summit was a call to action, mobilizing activists, policymakers, and others to address some of the world's most pressing environmental challenges.
那在20年前呢，里约热内卢的地球高峰会呢，是一个对全球行动者的号召。那希望大家都来关心这个世界最严重的环境挑战。
And today, 2 decades later, the Nourishing the Planet project highlights how agriculture is emerging as a solution to some of these problems.
那20年后的今天呢，滋养地球的创新方法计划呢，它主要谈的是农业可以怎么样解决这些曾经被认为很严重的环境问题。
And two decades ago, eco-agricultural practices like conservation farming and organic farming were dismissed as the way to feed the world, but today that's changing.
那在20年前，相同的生态农业的做法，以及有机农业，还有保育型的农法，为了这个世界呢，为了要促使我们的产量提升，反而把这些方法都消除了，并没有再使用它。但是这个现象现在已经在改变。
Over the last 8 months, we've had the incredible opportunity to launch State of the World all over the world.
那过去的8个月当中，我们很高兴能够将我们《世界现况》这本书在全世界各地发行。
We've launched the book in the United States, in India, Finland, Copenhagen, the United Kingdom, Germany, Spain, and South Africa.
那我们所发行的国家有印度、芬兰、哥本哈根、德国、意大利、英国、西班牙以及南非。
And we're extremely excited about the response that we're getting from journalists, from academics, and from the international funding and donor communities.
那我们很兴奋的收到了许多读者，那这些读者的回应，那这些读者包括一些记者，然后一些捐助单位以及基金会等等。
What I'll try to do very briefly this afternoon is to take you on a journey.
那我今天下午要带大家进行一个小旅程。
A journey to the 25 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that Nourishing the Planet visited throughout 2009, 2010, and 2011.
那这个小旅行呢，大家要跟着我去这个漠南非洲，我们这个滋养地球创新方法的计划所拜访的一些地方。那这些地方我们是在2009年、2010年及2011年走访的。
And I'll explain how agroecological practices are the key to reducing poverty, alleviating malnutrition, and stabilizing climate change.
在这个小旅程当中，我将向各位解释生态农业的方法是如何在这些地区来减少贫穷，然后对抗营养不良，并且呢面对气候变迁。
I'm really thrilled to be able to share what we've learned and introduce you to the hundreds of projects that we've been able to visit.
很高兴有这个机会，在用短短的时间跟大家介绍这个数百个计划当中我们所获得的一些经验。
First, let me give you some background on the research we did for our project and why we decided to focus State of the World 2011 on agriculture.
那首先让我跟各位分享一些这个计划的背景。那为什么我们决定要在2011年世界现况来谈食物跟农业这个主题？
As I've mentioned, we've done unprecedented on-the-ground research for nourishing the planet and state of the world.
那这本书呢，我们是跟过去的世界现况不太一样，这是一个前所未有的很草根性的研究。
We traveled to remote grazing lands and densely populated cities, talking to livestock keepers and pastoralists in Samburu, Kenya, and Kampala, Uganda.
那我们走访的地方包括一些各国的一些放牧地，包括这个肯亚、乌干达、南非，还有一些还拜访了一些牧民。
We met with farm workers in rural Zimbabwe.
那我们也在辛巴威的乡村地区认识了一些务农的工作者。
We visited women's dairy and market garden cooperatives in Ghana and Niger.
那我们也拜访了一些在加纳以及尼日的落农妇女。
We interviewed organic cotton growers in Burkina Faso.
那我们也在布吉纳法索认识了一些种植有机棉花的农民。
We learned about rice breeding from farmers outside of Antananarivo, Madagascar.
那我们也在马达加斯加呢认识了一些种稻子的农民。
And we visited countless other projects throughout Eastern, Southern, and Western Africa.
那在东非、南非以及西非，我们都看到了、眼见了不同的计划。
What we tried to do was work with local organizations and local institutions and get their stories to a wider audience.
那我们的目的是希望让更多这些故事呢，这些人的故事能够传播出去。
We did this through our website, nourishingtheplanet.org.
那特别是透过我们的网站，就是 nourishingtheplanet.org。
Through our videos and through our social media networks.
那还有透过网络以及我们的社群以及影片。
Through our extensive network of environmental and agricultural journalists.
那同时也跟一些我们所认识的环境以及农业相关的记者合作。
Through radio and television interviews.
那透过广播以及电台的访问。
And in columns, articles, and op-eds in countless papers in sub-Saharan Africa and all over the world.
那同时透过这个世界其他地区以及漠南非洲地区的各大报纸为他们写专栏文章等等。
Their stories are the stories of hope and success in agriculture.
那其实我们所看到这些故事呢，都是农业方面的希望以及成功的案例。
Innovative ideas of what's working from an area of the world that unfortunately is not well known for positive examples.
那这些案例呢，其实都充满着创新的一些想法。那而且这些想法都是来自一个通常不被看到它正面案例的一个大陆。
We're so used to hearing only about HIV/AIDS and conflict and famine in sub-Saharan Africa that we've forgotten that there's another side to the continent.
那我们对于非洲的印象，总是听到的就是 HIV/AIDS 或者是冲突饥荒。那这些事情都让我们忘记这个大陆还有它的另外一面。
Another side of hope, another side of success, and another side of self-reliance.
那它的另外一面其实充满希望、成功以及自给自足的案例。
1/3 of the authors of State of the World 2011 are African experts.
那我们这本书呢，2011世界现况有1/3的作者其实是非洲的专家。
These are people we met with who are working directly on the ground with communities.
那这些专家其实他们都是在第一线与社区工作者。
They're working on innovations that are helping increase yields, improve livelihoods.
那他们的工作，他们希望呢，透过创新的方法来增加农作物的产量，并且改善人们的生计。
Foster better health and raise incomes.
促进大家的健康，并且呢，提升大家的收入。
And improve gender equity.
并且改善了性别之间的平等。
These are also innovations that have multiple benefits of improving soil and water quality.
这些创新的方法，同时当然能够改善水土的品质。
Reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
那同时降低温室气体的排放，
and protecting biodiversity.
并且保护生物多样性。
We're really hoping that State of the World 2011 can serve as a roadmap for the funding and donor communities.
同时，我们也希望这本书呢，能够作为一个指引，来吸引更多的捐助者，还有社区投入并且支持这些计划。
We're hoping that it will help point them to projects that have real potential to be replicated and scaled up.
那希望这些捐助者或者是有兴趣的人能够被吸引，然后对这些有潜力但是没有被注意到的计划能够再进行支持。
But before I begin talking about those innovations, I need to talk a little bit about the bad news for a few minutes.
那在我们进入创新的方法之前，我还是要花一点点的时间，来谈谈一些负面的事情。
We live in a world where we produce more food than ever before.
现在的世界其实我们所生产的食物是比以前来的更多的。
At the same time, nearly 1 out of 6 members of the human family goes to bed hungry each night.
但是这个世界上呢，每个家庭约有1/6的人是会遭受到饥荒的。
And at least 1 billion people live on less than $2 per day.
那至少有10亿的人口呢，每天的收入大概只有不到2块钱美金。
Water scarcity is increasing, soil fertility is decreasing.
那我们缺水的问题是在增加的，但是同时土壤的肥力却是在减少的。
And climate change is the likely culprit in more extreme weather events, like the devastating droughts that have hit China and Russia.
那我们可以知道，气候变迁呢，可能是极端气候现象的罪魁祸首。那同时这些灾害呢，正在侵袭着，例如苏联啊、中国等国。
As well as the disastrous floods that have killed or displaced millions of farmers in Pakistan.
那同时像在巴基斯坦这个国家呢，洪水正在也在不久前也伤害了许多人的生命，同时呢迫使许多人离开他们的家园。
In addition, famine has re-emerged in the Horn of Africa, putting millions of people at risk for starvation.
那同时在非洲角这个地方，饥荒也正在打击当地的人，有数以百万计的人都遭受饥荒。
Despite the very best efforts of scientists and farmers and funders and donors, hunger and poverty still persist in the world.
那尽管农民和科学家以及我们的捐助者都非常的努力，但是饥荒的问题还是在全世界各地出现。
One reason that these problems still exist is that governments worldwide continue to underfund agriculture.
那这样子的现象的原因，其实是对世界各国的政府呢，其实都对于农业的补助实在是太少了。
Since the 1980s, agriculture's share of global development has dropped from over 16% to a meager 4%.
那从1980年以来呢，全球发展相关的基金或是援助，从16%降到现在的4%。
And only a handful of nations in Africa devote 10% or more of their national budgets to agriculture.
那在非洲只有少数几个国家，他们对于农业的经费呢是占着超越他们全国经费的10%。
Food prices remain high and increasingly volatile.
我们粮食价格呢逐渐在攀升。
And this is at a time when Africa in particular is more dependent on food imports than ever before.
那但是同时，非洲的许多国家，对于粮食进口的依赖是在增加的。
Since 2005, food prices in many developing nations have increased 50 to 80%.
那从2005年开始呢，发展中的国家对于他们的粮 粮食价格它的增加比例是大概从50%到80%。
These high prices have led to things like the food riots that we've seen in Mozambique over the last year, and even the revolutions that have taken place in Tunisia and Egypt.
那这个现象呢，其实也导致了我们最近听到的像莫桑比克的因为粮食引起的动乱，或者是过去不久前埃及及突尼西亚他们的革命都与这个相关。
20 years ago, Africa received 4% of the food it consumed from imports.
那在20年前，非洲呢，非洲国家他们大概有4%的食物是进口的。
Today, that figure is 12% or 3 times as much.
那但是现在呢，他们进口比例是12%，也就是3倍之多。
This could partly be a result of rising incomes, but our analysis and State of the World shows that it's also the result of worsening conditions for domestic farmers.
那这也有可能是因为收入的增加，但是根据他们的研究呢，这也可能是因为小农的处境变得更加艰巨。
If you walk into a grocery store in Abidjan or in Senegal in Dakar, you'll find very few products that are actually produced in those countries.
那如果你在象牙海岸或是塞内加尔这几个国家，你走进一个超级市场，你会看到的呢，就是一些从法国像比利时、法国进口的牛奶。
What you'll find is boxed milk from Belgium and France and rice that comes from Thailand.
那除了牛奶以外，还有泰国进口的稻米。
This is the case even though both Senegal and the Ivory Coast could produce more than enough of these products to feed their own population.
那这个虽然是一个平常现象，但是其实这几个国家他们自己都其实都出产了足够的乳制品以及稻米。
And over the past 2 decades, Africa's food output has become more and more narrowed on raw commodities, including maize and wheat, and less on more nutritious indigenous foods like millet and vegetables.
那过去20年来呢，非洲国家他们所产出的作物其实越来越狭窄，主要大概就是玉米啊、麦子，那反而很少产出当地的原生种的食物。
And while Africans tend to get most of their calories from starchy staple crops, there's been very little research and very little investment in what makes those starchy staple crops taste good.
那虽然非洲他们主要的主食当中呢有很多淀粉类的植物，但是对于如何让这些淀粉类的植物吃起来比较美味，却不太有足够的研究和经费。
In 2002, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research invested $118 million on research on cereals and staple crops.
在2002年呢，国际的农业研究机构总共大概投资了1亿1800万的美元在研究谷类。
In the same year, they invested just $15 million on fruit and vegetable research, or about 13% as much.
但是在水果以及蔬菜方面的投资却只有1570万美元。
As we show in this table, the per capita added value output of agriculture in the world increased by 35% since the 1960s.
那现在投影片上这张表格所显示出来的是，从1960年代呢，每个农业人口的产值大概增加了35%。
But it actually decreased by 12% in sub-Saharan Africa.
但是在漠南非洲地区却是降低了12%。
This means that the millions of poor farmers in sub-Saharan Africa are earning less than they ever have.
那这代表说，这些漠南地区的农民，他们的收入是前所未有的低。
So it's really against this backdrop that I want to talk about the sorts of solutions that offer the same tremendous returns on investment of the green revolution of past decades.
那延续着这样子的一些背景资料呢，我现在要谈的就是这些创新的方法如何能够如同所谓的过去几十年的绿色革命产生出同样大的回馈。
These examples are the good news that I found after traveling in sub-Saharan Africa for 2 years.
这些例子都是从我在漠南非洲地区旅行所得到的经验。
State of the World 2011 offers a wealth of innovations and principles that will hopefully show the funding and donor communities what is being practiced on the ground every day in sub-Saharan Africa.
那2011世界现况呢，这本书提供了许多创新的方法及原则。那这些创新的方法及原则，我们希望呢，它能够为赞助者及对不起，为赞助者做一个指引，然后就这样子。
These are innovations that are being practiced every day in farmers' fields, in laboratories, in cities all over sub-Saharan Africa.
那这些创新的指引，创新的方法其实都是在非洲，不管是在农地，或者是在实验室，或者是在他们的城市当中都被实践的。
So today I will present a few of the innovations that we think have been neglected and as a result deserve more attention and really show the untapped potential to transform rural economies throughout the African continent.
那这些创新的方法，我希望都是他们其实都是被忽略的。但是他们都是可以改善乡村的经济。
First, we need to make better use of rain-fed land.
首先我们必须要更善加利用雨水来孕育我们的土地。
Across much of Africa, water is the limiting factor in agricultural production.
那在整个非洲呢，水通常是农业生产的一个限制因子。
Only 4% of the land in Africa is equipped for irrigation.
在非洲呢，大概只有4%的土地呢是有灌溉系统的。
But there's a lot of potential to expand this with low-cost, small-scale irrigation systems.
但是呢，对于装置一个非常便宜而且小规模的灌溉系统来说，其实还有很多发展的潜力。
In Niger and Benin, for example, I visited very small solar drip irrigation projects that are helping women farmers improve their families' diets and also raise incomes.
在尼日还有贝南这2个国家，我拜访了一些小规模的太阳能滴灌系统。这些滴灌系统呢，在帮助当地的妇女改善他们家庭的营养摄取以及他们的收入。
I had the opportunity to visit a garden project in Tonka Village, which is about 150 kilometers north of Niamey, the capital of Niger.
我曾经拜访过尼日的首都北方150公里的一个乡村。
There, the International Crop Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics is working with about 100 women farmers.
在那边有一个当地的国际组织，在帮助大概超过100个妇女。
They're teaching these women how to maintain their drip irrigation lines.
这个组织教导当地的妇女怎么样维护这些滴灌式的系统。
Use compost and also incorporate trees into their crop production.
同时呢，教他们做堆肥以及农林建作的方法，来增加他们的作物的产量。
One of the farmers I met with told me that her income has tripled from around $300 per year to more than $1,000 since she began working in the garden.
有一个农夫跟我分享说呢，自从我参与了这个计划之后，我的每一年我的收入增加了300到1000美金每年。
And more importantly, she told me that she and her husband and her children all eat better now.
她也分享说，现在她的孩子跟她的先生也都吃得更好。对不起，刚刚是说她从300美元每年，她的收入增加到1000美元。
There's also a lot of potential in making sure that the rain that falls on the other 96% of Africa's cropland is used much better.
那其实呢，还是有很多潜力可以让我们把这个雨水呢，降在好好的被利用在剩下的95%还没有灌溉系统的土地上。
As you can see from this graph, rainfall in Niger is closely correlated with economic growth.
那从简报上这张图，我们可以看到，在尼日呢，雨水量跟他们的经济成长几乎是相呼应的。
In other words, more rain simply translates to better income and more money in the pockets of farmers.
所以说也就是降雨越多，他们的收入越多，然后农民所获取的也可以越多。
And this is increasingly important in Niger, where the majority of the residents earn less than $1.25 per day.
那这对于呢尼日这个国家的人民，每天大概就是有赚取1亿元美金，这样子的一个国家来说，这雨水的善用是非常重要的。
Unfortunately, right now, because of degraded soils, as little as 5 to 15% of rainfall actually reaches crops in parts of sub-Saharan Africa.
那很可惜的是说，随着这个土壤的越来越贫瘠，只有5%到15%的雨水是被利用在农作上。
But there are very simple and low-cost solutions to help farmers.
但是这些滴灌系统是非常简单而且非常廉价的解决方法。
Even without irrigation infrastructure, farmers can insulate themselves from the worst effects of drought and find ways to boost yields in rainy years by mulching, reducing tillage, and planting cover crops.
那即使没有安装灌溉系统，还是有一些很简单的方法可以让农民减少被干旱所害。那这些方法呢，比如说像增加覆盖物，然后减少翻耕，以及做农林兼种的手法。
In Kenya, Ethiopia, Zambia, and Tanzania, researchers have found that using soil and water conservation practices had yield gains of 20 to 120% for maize.
在肯亚、伊索比亚、还有上比亚以及坦桑尼亚这些国家呢，研究员发现，实行水土保持的保育型的农法呢，可以增加他们当地玉米的产量从20%到120%不等。
The yield gains for farmers growing teff, which is a staple crop in Ethiopia, were from 35 to 90%.
那在伊索比亚有一种主食作物叫做 teff， 那同样的这些方法能够提升teff 的生产量，从大约可以增加35%到90%不等。
The financial benefit of these investments was substantial enough that 5 years after the trials were completed, the farmers who participated continued to practice these methods, and they also spread their knowledge to neighboring communities and farms.
那这些投资所带来的回馈呢是非常大的，非常好的。所以在实施这些方法5年之后呢，当地的农民也开始向其他的社区介绍这些方法，影响他们邻近的社区的农民。
And the World Agroforestry Center is working with 12 rainwater associations in Eastern and Southern Africa to help publicize rainwater harvesting information and then make sure that that information gets to farmers.
那在东非以及南非呢，有一个世界农林建作中心，他们跟当地12个雨水收集的组织合作，那出版了一些有关于雨水收集的资讯，那并且非常确保这些资讯都到达农民的手上。
For example, I visited farms in Rwanda where they're using trapezoidal-shaped ponds that collect and store rainwater, making it more available throughout the year.
那例如在卢安达，他曾经拜访过一个农村，那当地的人呢以梯形的这种水池来收集雨水，并且用在灌溉上。
The World Agroforestry Center is also working with Maasai women farmers in Kenya to to help them build rainwater collection tanks for their roofs.
那刚刚提到的农林建作中心，他们也在肯亚与马赛族的妇女呢，来建造屋顶的雨水收集桶。
These catchment tanks allow the women to have extra water to use for their gardens as well as for household use.
那这些雨水收集呢，可以帮助当地的妇女用在自己的家，不只用在家庭，也用在他们的农园。
And in Axum, Ethiopia, I met with farmers who are working with the NGOs Prola Nova and GTZ to develop water lifting technologies and erosion control practices.
那在伊索比亚，我也遇到了一些农民，这些农民跟当地的 NGO 组织合作，来从事这个脚踩式的集水收集，以及从事土壤流失控管的技术。
Both of these techniques make it easier to make better use of rain when it falls in this very dry region of Ethiopia.
这些手法技术都帮助都让雨降下来的时候呢，他们能够更加妥善利用水资源。
Cas Malede Abreha, who is the farmer in this photo, is someone I met in Ethiopia, and he is featured in Chapter 5 of State of the World.
那这个照片上这位先生是我在伊索比亚所遇到的农民呢，他的故事是在第5章的世界现况的第5章当中有提到。
Cass is using the skills he's learned working with the NGOs to develop a series of low-tech treadle pumps that have dramatically increased his yields.
那这位先生他所用的方法就是从 NGO 从当地 NGO 学来的，那他用的是脚踩式的集水方式。
These pumps have allowed him to expand his farm and diversify the crops that he's growing.
那这个脚踩集水方式增加了他的农作的收入，而且让他种一些他过去不能种的植物，并且增加他的农地的多样性。
The pumps have also increased his income enough that he's been able to do things he couldn't do before, like send his children to school and build a better home.
那这样子的方法呢，让他做一些过去他所不能够达到的工作的事情，就是像送他的孩子去上学。
In addition, Cass has started his own business, building pumps for other farmers and training them how to do erosion control on their own farms.
那此外呢，他也因此创立了一个小的事业。那这个事业就是帮助其他的农民来做同样的系统，以及从事土壤保持的工作。
And more importantly, Cass has become a symbol of innovation and success in his community, showing what can be done.
那他在他的社区呢，也成为一个成功的案例与象征。其实。
And while these treadle pumps might sound very primitive to those of us in this room, they're helping more than 250,000 farmers in Africa bring water to their crops.
那这个脚踩式的系统呢，虽然看起来非常的原始，但是它还是帮助了25万的漠南非洲的地区的农民。
Agronomist Roland Bunch also describes in his chapter of State of the World the importance of cover crops and green manure for both protecting water resources as well as soil.
那世界现况这是第几章？没有，对不起，一个农经学家 Roland Bunch 先生呢，他在他的文章当中有提到，运用覆盖作物以及绿肥，来做水土保持的功效以及重要性。
These practices help prevent soil erosion and desertification.
那这些方法呢，可以减少水土的流失以及沙漠化。
And they help farmers add nutrients to the soil without spending money on expensive fertilizers.
那同时帮助农民可以在他们的土壤上面增加肥力以及营养，不需要多花钱。
Bunch estimates that over the next decade, fertilizer in places like Mali and Niger will simply be too expensive for most farmers to afford.
那但是这位农经学家认为说，在未来的10年当中，我们的肥料呢都会变得太昂贵，所以在某些国家像尼日啊、马利这样子的国家，农民可能就没有办法再支付肥料的支出。
That is why making cheaper, more natural ways of adding nutrients to the soil, such as green manure, will be more important than ever before.
那这也是为什么运用比较便宜而且比较自然的方法来为土壤增加肥力，就是变得更重要。
The next innovation I want to talk about is cutting down on food waste.
那接下来要谈的是怎么样减少食物的损失。
Food waste can total an astonishing 25 to 50% of the global harvest.
那我们现在全球的农作收获量呢，对不起，我们现在全球的食物损耗量可以达到全球收获量的20%到50%。
This is a really staggering figure when you consider how much the world invests in boosting yields and raising production.
那这样子的数据，其实对于我们现在一直在谈或者一直在想怎么样增加全世界的农产量来说，其实是非常惊讶的一个数字。
In State of the World, author Tristram Stewart describes how the United States and other developed countries have really mastered the art of preventing food waste.
那在世界现况的某一个章节当中呢，美国的一位作者提到，像世界上某些国家，例如美国，以及一些富裕的国家，如何有一些创新的方法来避免食物的浪费。
We've done this with climate-controlled storage units or refrigeration.
那这些方法，例如是利用冷冻及保存的技术。
With energy-intensive drying equipment.
例如还有干燥的技术。
With chemicals that inhibit sprouting or fungus or mold.
或者是一些预防霉菌产生的一些化学。
And through plant breeds that are designed to extend shelf life.
那或者是透过育种的方式来增加保存期限。
Unfortunately, rich countries still waste vast amounts of food.
但是当然除了这些方法之外，世界上的食物的损耗还是很多的。
We throw away cosmetically imperfect produce.
我们通常都会把一些可能受到碰撞的不好看的一些食物丢掉。
We dispose of edible fish at sea.
那我们也会在海里面捞上来的鱼丢掉，因为我们不想要它们。
We overorder stock at grocery stores.
那有时候也会订太多的货。
And we purchase too much food for home consumption that ends up not in our stomachs but in landfills.
那通常我们也常常买太多的食物，那最后会把这些食物丢到掩埋场。
And in poorer countries, and especially those in sub-Saharan Africa, crop storage remains woefully inadequate, allowing crops to go to waste in the places that they're really needed the most.
那很可惜，就是特别在漠南非洲地区呢，很多作物的储存方法都还是很不足。那反而造成在这些最需要食物的国家，造成了很多食物的浪费。
Way back in 1974, at the first World Food Conference in Rome, there was a declaration for a 50% reduction in post-harvest losses.
1974年在罗马的举办的第一场的世界食品大会上呢，有一个宣誓是说，希望能够将食物的损耗量减少50%。
But unfortunately, some 40 years later, preventing food waste still remains a vastly underfunded part of the agricultural development process.
但是很可惜，经过了40年，这一项如何减少食物的损耗的研究以及投资都非常的少。
But the good news is that preventing food waste can be very simple and very inexpensive.
那好消息是说，要达到减少食物的耗损，其实可以是很简单而且很便宜的。
I had the opportunity to visit a project in Guinea that has achieved dramatic reductions in aflatoxin exposure.
在几内亚这个国家，我曾经拜访过一个计划，在当地使用一种叫做 aflatoxin 的一种技术，来减少食物的损害。
Aflatoxin is a harmful mold that can affect crops.
这种技术是一种霉菌，那它可以减少它。
刚刚讲者的意思是说，在非洲这个地方，他们有一个社区，他们想到一种方法来减少 aflatoxin 这种霉菌的污染。
The community, to battle this aflatoxin, implemented a series of procedures to prevent the fungal growth in ground nuts or peanuts.
他们
他们有一种能够不会很贵的方法来预防这种菌类的生长。
These included sorting the nuts,
包括挑拣那个果实。
They did this by eliminating any that were moldy or damaged.
把已经发霉或者是受损的部分挑掉。
And they also dried the nuts on fiber mats made out of locally available materials.
同时透过日晒，然后并且用比较自然的一些当地可取得的一些素材来做包装。
This was instead of drying the nuts on the ground, which is typically done in a lot of these villages.
那这个一般我们直接在地上做日晒是不一样的。
I also visited sweet potato farms in Ghana.
那同时我也拜访了在加纳的一个那个不是地瓜的生产者。
There I learned that taking the tops off the sweet potatoes before they were stored has been shown to protect the crop from waste by nearly half.
在那边我学到说，如果先把地瓜的那个头的部分先处理掉的话，这样可以减少50%的损耗，可以保存比较久。
And harvesting the potatoes a little earlier in the season than usual can also improve storage while also maintaining yield, flavor, and nutritional value.
然后同时呢，早一点收成呢，也可以增加它的保存期限，同时也不会减少产量，那还是可以让它一样的美味跟营养。
And these are practices that involve very little time or money on the part of farmers.
那这些做法其实都很省钱且省时间。
Food waste can also be prevented when villages can invest in community storage facilities, such as rice granaries that I saw in Madagascar.
同时呢，如果整个社区都投资一些共同的储存系统的话，也可以大量的减少食物的耗损。
They can also invest invest in the sort of bean storage containers that I saw in Benin or the cassava processing centers that are all over Nigeria.
那例如这些共同的储存系统就包括在他在贝南看到的一些储藏器，以及在尼日看到的呢处理树薯的一些加工中心。
In Western Africa, cowpeas are a staple crop, but they often go to waste because of mold or invasion from pests.
那在西非豇豆是当地的一种主食，但是它常常会受到发霉或是虫害。
But Purdue University researchers have helped farmers use inexpensive sealed bags to prevent the cowpeas from being invaded by pests and mold.
普渡大学的一些研究员帮助当地的农民呢，去发展一种密封袋，来减少虫害还有这个霉菌的问题。
In West Africa, improved storage for half of the area's cowpea harvest could be worth $255 million to farmers.
那在西非呢，改善过后的这个储存方法能够让当地的农民获得2.55亿的美元的价值。
And dairy farmers I met with in Kenya and Mauritania are using very low-tech ways of storing and drying milk to make the milk protein available for a greater portion of the year.
那在肯亚，我也遇到一些酪农，他们因为改善储藏以及干燥牛奶的方法，让牛奶的这些蛋白质可以保存更久，然后送到这个消费者的手中。
One of the farmers I met with in Kenya is using plastic bags sealed with candle wax to sell the goat milk that she produces.
那在肯亚，我遇到的一个酪农呢，他就用塑胶袋，然后以蜡烛的蜡来密封，来保存他的牛奶。
She learned this very simple process through a local training program sponsored by an NGO in Kenya.
那他是从跟当地的一个 NGO 合作学到这个技术。
The bags make it easier for her to manage and sell her milk.
那这种袋装式的牛奶，让它更容易管理，还有销售它的牛奶。
And it allows her customers to purchase small quantities of the perishable product in very small containers.
那这也让消费者可以买比较少的量。
These sorts of practices can be used by urban milk producers in other cities in Africa.
其实这样子简单的方法可以适用于世界各地的都市。
There are also very interesting and income-generating ways of transforming foods so that they don't get wasted.
那还有一些改变食物的性状，让他们避免被浪费掉的一些方法。
For example, solar-powered dryers and dehydrators.
例如太阳能的食物干燥器。
Can help preserve abundant harvests of mangoes and other fruits, making the vitamins that they contain more available throughout the year.
那这样的方法可以来干燥，例如芒果这一类的水果，然后让他们的让这些他们水果当中所保存的维他命还有营养可以保存得更久。
And these sorts of preservation techniques give farmers, and especially women farmers, an extra product to sell to help raise their incomes.
那这些保存的方法都可以帮助农民来提升他们的收入，特别是女性的农民。
Now for my third point, which is to plan for more farmers in cities.
接下来要谈的是城市农民。
Africa is urbanizing faster than the rest of the world, with 14 million people moving into cities each year.
那非洲是现在全世界都市化速度最快的地区之一，大概每年会有1400万的人涌向城市。
migration is second only to the massive rural to urban migration taking place in Chinese cities.
那这个现象，向都市移居的现象是仅次于现在中国大陆所在发生的现象。
This shift will strain urban infrastructure and pressure farmland in and around cities.
那这样子的一个变动会让城市的一些设施都产生更大的压力。那同时在城市附近的农田也都是会有产生更大的压力。
It's estimated that by 2020, some 35 to 40 million Africans will depend entirely on food grown in cities to meet their daily food requirements.
那据研究，大概在截至2020年之前呢，大概会有3500万到4000万的非洲人呢，他们会住在都市里面，而且会大量的仰赖城市所生产出来的食物。
Fortunately, there's no shortage of models for very successful and productive urban farms.
同时呢，其实很幸运的，并没有这些例子已经有很多很具有生产力而且很成功的例子。
But it will be very important for communities and policymakers to recognize the role that these farms can play in addressing food security.
但是我们需要更多的政府以及相关的人员呢，去认同说，或者说去看到城市农园的重要性。
And cities will need to modify land and sewage regulations to prepare for these farms of the future.
那未来的城市都需要在我们的下水系统或者是我们的土地利用系统做改变，来为城市农园的未来做准备。
As you saw in the video, I had the opportunity to visit Kibera, which is the largest slum in sub-Saharan Africa with nearly 1 million people.
那刚刚在影片当中看到的是 Kibera 这个地方，这个是莫南非洲地区最大的贫民窟，大概有100万人。
There, several thousand women have organized themselves into what they call self-help groups.
那在那里，当地的妇女组织了一些自助会。
These groups are working with NGOs to find innovative ways to grow food in their very small backyards.
那这些组织呢，他们是一起用创新的方法，在他们很小的院子里种出食物。
One innovative thing that they've done is develop what they call vertical gardens. You can see just the very top of that, of a vertical garden in that picture on the left.
那在这照片当中，其中一张有一个很小的影像，就可以看到他们所用的方法就是直立式的园圃。
The women grow leafy greens, tomatoes, and okra on different levels of these very tall sacks that are filled with soil.
那当地的妇女在这些很小小的直立式的空间当中种了一些秋葵啊、番茄啊、茄子等等。
The women sell the produce that they grow to other people in their community, and they also consume part of what they grow.
那这些作物呢，是除了他们自己食用之外，他们也进行贩卖。
And these vertical gardens turned out to be a very important source of food security in 2007 and 2008.
这些直立式的农园呢，在2007年及2008年扮演着非常的重要的角色，在就食物粮食安全而言，扮演着非常重要的角色。
During that time, a series of riots and strikes occurred in Nairobi that prevented any food from being transported into the slums.
在这2年当中，因为奈洛比有一些动乱，那所以食物没有办法送到他们的都市当中。
But the people who were growing food in vertical gardens didn't go hungry because they had their own very local source of food security.
那所以这些直立式园圃的农民呢，他们就没有因此而受到任何饥荒或者是受到影响。
Another group of farmers in Kibera is doing some innovative gardening on an empty lot that is adjacent to the slums.
那在这个贫民区当中，还有另外一个农民的组织，他们也用创新的方法在空地上面种植。
This group is is made up mostly of women who have farmed this area of land for around 20 years.
那这个组织也是由一群在这个地方呢耕种超过20年以上的妇女所组成的。
The farmers are not only growing enough food to eat and to sell, but perhaps surprisingly, they're also becoming a source of seed for rural farmers.
这些农民不仅自己喂饱自己，然后还销售他们的作物。这更令人惊讶的是，他们还保存种子卖给其他的地方。
Using very small plots of land, the farmers are raising seeds for amaranth, for okra, for tomatoes, and several other indigenous vegetables.
那他们用很小的空间呢，种植在地的蔬菜，然后保存了一些种子，包括苋菜的种子、秋葵、番茄以及当地的原生作物的种子。
Many of the varieties that they're growing only take 3 months to produce.
那许多他们所种植的蔬菜，只要3个月就会长出来。
And they're getting a big profit, or about 3,000 Kenyan shillings for each kilogram of seed that they're selling.
那每1公斤呢，他们可以卖掉每1公斤的当地的种子可以卖掉3000现令，也就是当地的币值。
And these seed plots, because they're very small, take very little additional time or financial investment for the farmers.
那由于他们所生产种子这些园圃都很小，所以其实他们不太需要增加太多的经费跟时间。
And the seed production project helps dispel the myth that urban agriculture can only feed the poor and hungry in cities. It can also be a source of inputs for rural areas.
那他们的案例呢，就告诉了人们说，消除了一个迷思，就是说，城市农园只能够喂饱当地的一些贫穷的人，但事实上他们还是可以创造其他的经济效益，并且支持乡村。
One of the farmers I met with who has been involved in the seed production project told me that her life has dramatically changed since she began growing the seeds.
那某一位从事这个种子保存以及销售的农民呢，告诉他说，自从他开始种植以及保存这些种子之后呢，他的生活大大的改变。
She's been able to send her daughter to school for the first time.
那他首次能够将他的孩子送到学校，将他的女儿送到学校去读书。
And she's also saved enough money to buy her own piece of land outside of Nairobi, making her a landowner for the first time.
那他也首次能够存足够的钱在奈洛比的外围的土地，他也首次能够有足够的钱来购买土地。
It's also important to remember that urban agriculture can help city dwellers not just in developing countries, but also here in places like Taiwan.
那我们必须要知道说，其实城市农耕不仅能够帮助发展中国家的一些城市居民，那还有其实还像其他的地方，例如台湾也会有很大的贡献。
One thing that I knew about Taipei before coming here is that hundreds and hundreds of residents are growing food on rooftops, on their balconies, in their backyards, and in empty lots.
在我来到台湾之前呢，我就有听过台北呢，就有一些人就有很多的居民都在屋顶啊、院子啊，或者是一些空地种菜。
These urban farms not only improve nutrition and bring fresh food to urban areas, but they've also been shown to improve interactions between community members and help making cities better places to live.
这些城市农夫不仅能够提供自己更好的营养，而且获得更多新鲜的蔬菜水果，那同时也能够增加人与人之间的互动，那让这个城市变得更好。
Fourth and finally, it's important to remember that farmers aren't just farmers.
那最后其实要提的重点是，其实农夫不只是农夫。
They're business women and they're businessmen.
他们其实是可以是商人。
And they're stewards of the land who deserve to be compensated for the ecosystem services that they provide that have widespread and global benefits.
那他们其实也是土地的管理者，而且值得被尊重，因为他们都是他们提供了我们的土地非常多的好处，以及进行了许多生态性的服务。
For example, very creative incentives and programs are emerging in Africa to pay farmers for storing carbon in their soils.
例如在非洲呢，有很多有创意的方案，他们补助农民来协助进行碳的补给。
We estimate in Chapter 2 of State of the World that African farmers could remove 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere over the next 50 years.
那在世界现况的第2章当中，我们预估呢，在未来的50年当中，非洲的农民就可以协助我们进行大概500亿吨的碳的补给。
They can do this primarily by planting trees among crops.
那他们只要透过农林建作的手法
，stewarding and protecting nearby forests.
或者是保护以及管理邻近地区的森林
，and keeping their soils planted with crops for more of the year.
那并且呢，确保他们的土地并且确保他们在土地上种满作物。
That 50 billion tons of carbon is like eliminating an entire year of the world's greenhouse gas emissions.
那其实500亿吨的二氧化碳几乎就是全球1年所产生的碳排放量。
And it would be a very generous contribution from an area of the world that emits only a tiny share of those gases.
那对于这些对于这一群呢他们的碳排放量其实很小的一群人来说，这是他们对地球做的最大的贡献，极大的贡献。
Already, 75 projects in 22 countries across Africa are in the works to begin compensating farmers and rural communities for sequestering carbon.
那在非洲22个国家，大概有75个计划都在补助农民协助进行碳补给的方案。
There are some very large-scale efforts in this area, from the Great Green Wall that's being proposed by heads of state through the Sahara from Senegal to Djibouti.
那有一个很大型的方案呢，叫做绿色的长城。那这个绿色的长城，是从撒哈拉到塞内加尔以及吉布地这个国家。
The wall will be over 7,000 kilometers long and 15 kilometers wide.
这个绿色长城是会达到7000公里长，然后15公里宽。
The project is now included in the Strategic Cooperation Agreement between the African Union and the European Union.
那这个计划呢是非洲联盟以及欧盟他们之间的策略联盟计划。
These sorts of projects and innovations are exciting because changes in farming patterns that sequester more carbon in the soil will also help reduce water losses, boost yields, and protect soils.
那其实这些可以进行碳补给的这些手法呢，不仅可以达到碳补给的效益，其实同时也可以减少土壤及水土的流失。
But what's also really exciting about these projects is that they are the perfect example of agriculture emerging as a solution to global problems.
那更激励人心的是说，其实这样子的例子呢，就代表了农业其实可以是环境问题的解决之道。
Agriculture is now considered a key component in reducing public health costs.
那农业其实是可以帮助减少公共健康的相关支出。
Making cities more livable.
让城市更适宜人居。
Creating jobs in a stagnant economy.
那同时提供就业机会。
And even reducing climate change.
那甚至呢减少气候变迁的危害。
And this is exactly the sorts of agricultural innovations that will attract support from African governments, from NGOs and aid agencies, and from the international funding and donor communities.
那这些创新的方法，也就是能够吸引非洲的国家或者世界上其他国家更多的投入以 以及投资。
Let me close by saying that every week we highlight innovations on our website, nourishingtheplanet.org.
那最后我想跟大家提醒说，我们每个礼拜我们都在我们的网站上面做更新，我们的网站就是 nourishingtheplanet.org。
These are innovations not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but in Asia, Latin America, and we're also looking to highlight innovations that are going on in developed countries as well.
那这些案例呢，这些故事还有我们分享的经验，都不只会是不是关于非洲、亚洲，那其实也是会关于拉丁美洲，这世界上世界各地的案例。
So I will end there. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll look forward to hearing from the other panelists.
那我的分享暂时在这边结束，那我很期待再听其他2位分享者的演说。